They say that grief fades with time, but for Emily Carter, the past refuses to rest. When her 2-year-old daughter, Lily, starts pointing at her late father's casket during the funeral, everyone assumes it's just a child's confusion, until they look closer. What they find changes everything. A secret buried deep beneath layers of deception, a message hidden in plain sight, and a past that refuses to stay buried. What if everything you believed about someone you loved was a lie? What if the truth had been in front of you all along, waiting to be uncovered? Tonight, we dive into a story of heartbreaking revelations, betrayals, and a search for a truth that may be too painful to accept. Stay with us until the very end, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Emily Carter never imagined her life would unravel like this. The air inside the funeral home was thick with grief, the scent of lilies overpowering as people whispered condolences she could barely comprehend. It was supposed to be a day of closure, a final goodbye to her husband, Daniel. And yet, something felt disturbingly unfinished, as if a piece of him still lingered, refusing to let go. The heavy mahogany casket sat in the center of the room, surrounded by floral arrangements and flickering candlelight. Friends and family dressed in black murmured in hushed tones, their voices blending into an indistinct hum. Emily sat at the front, her fingers tightly wrapped around a damp tissue, staring blankly at the casket as her mind drifted through memories of Daniel. His laugh, the way he used to tuck Lily into bed, the way he always smelled of fresh pine after working outside. The weight of his absence pressed against her chest, suffocating. Lily, their 2-year-old daughter, was unusually quiet in her lap. She had been clinging to Emily all morning, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her dress as if she knew something was terribly wrong. Emily gently brushed her fingers through Lily's soft curls, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even to her own ears. Then, Lily did something that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. The little girl suddenly pointed at the casket, her tiny finger trembling slightly. "Daddy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's heart clenched. "Sweetheart, Daddy's sleeping?" she said softly, her voice breaking, but Lily shook her head, her brows furrowing in frustration. "No," she insisted, pointing more urgently. "Look." Emily followed her daughter's gaze, expecting nothing more than the polished wood of the casket. But as she stared, a flicker of unease settled in her chest. There, at the base of the casket, just above where Daniel's feet would be, was something carved into the wood. A series of numbers. Her breath hitched. It wasn't part of the design. It wasn't decorative. It was deliberate. She leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes, trying to make out the faint etching. The numbers weren't just random, they looked like coordinates. Emily's pulse quickened. Why would coordinates be engraved on her late husband's casket? Who put them there? Had Daniel left them himself, or had someone else done this? She turned sharply, scanning the room. No one else seemed to notice. The guests were lost in their grief, dabbing at their eyes, whispering to one another. Even Margaret, Daniel's mother, was too absorbed in silent sorrow to pay attention. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Mommy?" Lily tugged on her dress, her voice small but insistent. "Find Daddy." The words sent a chill through Emily's spine. Find Daddy. The funeral service proceeded in a blur. People approached her, offering condolences, squeezing her hands, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She couldn't stop thinking about the numbers, the coordinates. When the service finally ended and the casket was prepared for burial, she couldn't let it go. "Wait!" she called out as the funeral directors began to move the casket. She ignored the confused looks around her as she rushed forward. "Ma'am!" One of the staff members looked at her, puzzled. "There's something written on the casket," she said breathlessly. Did you put that there?" The man frowned. "Written? No, ma'am. The casket was sealed before delivery." Emily's heart pounded. She crouched slightly, running her fingers over the carved numbers. They were real, not her imagination. "What do they mean?" she whispered to herself. Margaret approached her then, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Emily, sweetheart, what are you doing?" Emily hesitated, debating whether or not to say anything. "Nothing," she murmured, stepping back. She didn't know why, but something told her to keep this to herself. The burial proceeded as planned, but even as the casket was lowered into the earth, Emily felt as if she were burying more than just her husband. She was burying a question, a mystery, and she wasn't sure she could leave it alone. That night, after everyone had left and the house was eerily quiet, Emily sat on the couch with her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her face in the dim room. She couldn't stop thinking about the coordinates. Carefully, she typed them into an online map search. Her breath caught in her throat when a location appeared. It was a remote area miles away from their home, deep in the countryside. "What were you trying to tell me, Daniel?" she whispered to the empty room. Lily stirred in her sleep, murmuring softly. Emily glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. She should sleep. She should let this go. But she knew she wouldn't. As she closed the laptop, one thought echoed in her mind. She had to go there, and she had to find out what Daniel had left behind. The weight of the coordinates lingered in Emily's mind like an unsolved puzzle, keeping her awake long after Lily had drifted into peaceful sleep. The night outside was eerily silent, the glow of the street lamp casting long shadows through her bedroom window. She should have been exhausted, but her mind refused to rest. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel had left her something hidden, something important, and she needed to know what it was. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the map again, staring at the location. It was an isolated spot, miles away, surrounded by nothing but open land and dense forest. There were no roads leading directly to it, just a stretch of dirt paths that disappeared into thick woods. A lump formed in her throat. Daniel had never mentioned a place like this. They had never traveled there together. But the fact that it was engraved on his casket, it meant something. Emily inhaled deeply. She needed answers, but she wasn't reckless. She couldn't just drive out to an unknown location alone, especially not in the middle of the night. But she also knew she wouldn't be able to function until she uncovered the truth. She had to go. The next morning, she dropped Lily off at her mother's house under the pretense of running errands. Her mother didn't ask many questions. She was still grieving too, lost in her own memories of Daniel. Emily kissed Lily's forehead, whispering a promise to return soon. Then she drove. The highway stretched endlessly before her, the landscape changing gradually from urban streets to empty fields and scattered houses. The farther she drove, the more isolated she felt. She kept glancing at the GPS, watching as the distance to the coordinates shrank. Her heart pounded with every mile. After nearly 2 hours, the paved road ended. The GPS directed her onto a narrow dirt path, lined with towering trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight. She hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This wasn't just a small detour, this was complete isolation. "Daniel, what were you hiding?" she whispered. She pressed forward. The trees grew thicker, their branches stretching over the path like skeletal fingers. The further she drove, the more uneasy she felt. It wasn't fear exactly, just a gnawing sense that she was stepping into something she wasn't prepared for. Then, suddenly, the GPS announced that she had arrived. Emily stopped the car, staring out the windshield. There was nothing, just a clearing surrounded by dense trees, the wind whispering through the leaves. No house, no markers, nothing that looked remotely significant. Her stomach tightened. She stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The silence was deafening. She walked forward cautiously, scanning the area for anything unusual. The coordinates had led her here for a reason. But what was she supposed to find? Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A single, weathered wooden post sticking out of the ground, barely noticeable beneath the overgrown grass. Her pulse quickened as she approached it. The wood was old, cracked from years of exposure, and carved into it, faint but unmistakable, was something that made her blood run cold. Daniel's initials, DC. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was it. He had been here. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the letters. Why had he left this? What was he trying to tell her? She turned in circles, scanning the ground, searching for anything else. Then, just a few feet away, something else caught her eye. A small patch of earth that looked different from the rest. Disturbed, her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees and started digging. The dirt was soft, giving way beneath her fingers. She clawed at it desperately, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. Then her fingers hit something solid. Wood. A box. She dug faster, pulling away the remaining dirt until she could lift it from the earth. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, its surface covered in dirt and time. The lock was rusted shut, but as she lifted it, the bottom weakened, and the contents spilled onto the ground. Emily's hands shook as she picked up the first item, a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized Daniel's handwriting. If you found this, it means I didn't have a choice. It means I couldn't tell you the truth. Her vision blurred with tears. You need to go to the next place. This isn't the end. Follow the sign. Emily's fingers tightened around the paper. The next place? The sign? Her gaze darted back to the box. Among the other items inside, a set of keys, a watch she didn't recognize, there was a small metal plaque. She turned it over in her hands, reading the single word engraved into it. Haven. Emily's mind raced. Haven? A place? A name? She had never heard Daniel mention it before. She sat there for a long time, staring at the objects in front of her, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. Daniel had left this for her. He had hidden it, knowing that one day she would come looking. Why? Why had he kept this from her? The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something she couldn't quite hear. But deep inside, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't stopping now. Emily sat in the middle of the clearing, her fingers tightening around the metal plaque with the word Haven engraved on it. The small wooden box lay open beside her, its contents scattered across the dirt. Daniel's cryptic letter, the unfamiliar watch, a rusted set of keys, and now, this plaque that meant nothing to her yet felt like everything. The weight of it all pressed heavily on her chest, the gravity of what she had just discovered shaking her to the core. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think rationally. If Daniel had left this behind, buried in the earth like some hidden relic, it wasn't by accident. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't some abstract message with no purpose. He had wanted her to find it. But why? She reached for the letter again, scanning the words she had already read, desperate for something more. Some clue she had overlooked. If you found this, it means I didn't have a choice. It means I couldn't tell you the truth. What truth? Emily clenched her jaw. Daniel had been the most loving, devoted husband of that, she was sure. But now, standing here in the middle of nowhere, staring at a letter he had written before his death, she felt a deep, unsettling realization creeping in. She hadn't known everything about him. That truth was becoming impossible to ignore. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her chest as a cold wind rustled through the trees. Haven. The word echoed in her mind over and over again. She had never heard Daniel mention it before. It wasn't the name of a place she recognized, not a town, not a landmark. But it meant something. It had to. She turned the plaque over in her hands, running her thumb across its rough metal surface. There were no additional markings, no numbers, no further clues. Just that single word, deliberately placed, meant for her to find. Emily swallowed hard and reached for her phone. With slightly trembling fingers, she typed Haven into the search bar of her map application. Her heart pounded as the screen loaded. Dozens of results appeared: businesses, streets, organizations. But one in particular caught her eye. Haven Memorial Park. Her breath hitched. A cemetery. Emily's blood turned cold. She tapped on the listing, pulling up the location. It wasn't far, about 40 miles south. The thought made her stomach tighten uncomfortably. Why would Daniel leave her a clue that led to a cemetery? A memory flashed in her mind. Daniel's funeral, the way Margaret had looked at the casket before it was lowered, the way she had hesitated before stepping back. Had she known? Emily shook the thought away. No, that was impossible. Margaret had been devastated when Daniel died. The grief in her eyes had been real, hadn't it? A wave of dizziness washed over her. She needed answers. She scooped up the remaining items from the box, carefully placing them back inside before standing. The forest around her felt eerily quiet, the silence stretching between the trees like something unseen was watching. She turned back toward her car, gripping the box tightly. Whatever was waiting for her at Haven Memorial Park, she was going to find it. The drive to Haven was long and restless. Emily's thoughts refused to settle, bouncing between memories of Daniel and the uneasy weight of his hidden message. The road stretched endlessly before her, winding through small towns and empty highways, the radio playing soft static as she drove in silence. When she finally pulled into the entrance of the cemetery, a deep sense of foreboding settled in her chest. The place was quiet, the kind of silence that felt sacred and untouched. Rows of headstones stretched into the distance, some adorned with fresh flowers, others weathered with time. A few visitors lingered in the distance, paying respects to their lost loved ones. Emily parked near the entrance and took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Then, she stepped out of the car. She had no idea where to start. She didn't even know what she was looking for. But as she walked through the cemetery, something inside her pulled her forward. She followed the winding path, scanning the names on the graves, waiting for something, anything, to stand out. Then she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat. A headstone near the edge of the cemetery, partially hidden beneath the shade of an old oak tree. The name carved into the stone sent a sharp chill down her spine. Michael Carter, Daniel's brother. But that was impossible. Michael had died years ago, long before she ever met Daniel. He had told her about it once, in passing, his voice tinged with sadness but never elaborating. She had never questioned it. But here he was, his grave right in front of her. Emily's knees felt weak. Why would Daniel leave her here? What did this mean? She stared at the headstone, searching for anything unusual. The date of death was almost 15 years ago. If that was true, then why would Daniel send her here? Her hands trembled as she knelt down, brushing away fallen leaves. Then something caught her eye, a small, barely noticeable engraving on the side of the stone. It was faint, almost as if someone had tried to hide it. But as she traced her fingers over the surface, she felt the familiar shape of numbers. Coordinates. Again. Her breath came in short gasps as she reached for her phone, quickly inputting the numbers into her map. The location appeared instantly, and this time it wasn't just a remote clearing in the woods. It was a house listed under no name, no owner, no history. Emily's vision blurred. Her hands clenched into fists. Something was very, very wrong. She staggered to her feet, her heart hammering in her chest. Daniel had led her here for a reason, and now he was leading her somewhere else. Emily turned back toward her car, gripping the keys so tightly that they left marks in her palm. She wasn't done. Not even close. Emily's fingers trembled around the steering wheel as she pulled away from Haven Memorial Park, her pulse thudding in her ears. The weight of what she had just discovered pressed heavily on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. Michael Carter's grave, the hidden coordinates, the house that shouldn't exist. None of it made sense, and yet it was happening. Daniel had left her a trail of breadcrumbs, deliberately guiding her toward something he had never been able to say out loud. But why? What was so important that he had gone to these lengths to keep it hidden, even in death? Emily kept glancing at her phone, the coordinates leading her further and further away from anything familiar. The road narrowed, the cityscape vanishing in her rearview mirror as she entered an area that felt untouched by time. The trees thickened along the highway, stretching high above her, blocking out the sky. The last gas station she had passed was miles behind her, and with every turn, civilization felt more like a distant memory. She gripped the wheel tighter, trying to suppress the growing unease curling in her stomach. The address had no listed owner, no records. It was as if the house had been wiped from existence. and yet it was there waiting for her. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon when she finally turned onto the road that matched the coordinates. It wasn't even a proper street, just a long, winding path of gravel and dirt, flanked by trees on both sides. Her tires crunched against the loose stones, the sound almost deafening in the stillness. Emily swallowed hard. Everything inside her screamed that she shouldn't be here, that she should turn around and go home. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when she was this close. Then finally she saw it. A house. It stood alone in the clearing, an old two-story structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The wood was weathered, the windows dark, the paint peeling away in places as if time had eaten away at its very foundation. It wasn't what she had expected. It was worse. She pulled the car to a stop and sat there, gripping the wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs. This house had a history. She could feel it. Emily exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move. She grabbed the small wooden box Daniel had left behind and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the silence pressing in around her like an unseen force. As she approached the front porch, the old wooden steps creaked beneath her weight. She hesitated. The door was closed, but something about it felt off. It wasn't locked. Emily reached out, her fingers grazing the rusted doorknob, and then she turned it. The door swung open with a slow groan, revealing the dark interior. Emily stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. Dust swirled in the air, illuminated by the dying light filtering through the cracked windows. The air smelled of time, of wood and dust and something else, something unnameable. The house was furnished, but barely. A worn-out couch sat in the center of the living room, covered in an old sheet. A wooden table stood near the kitchen, its surface littered with papers and objects she couldn't make out in the dim light. Everything was covered in dust, untouched, forgotten, except for one thing. Emily's pulse spiked as she noticed the single object on the mantel above the fireplace. A framed photograph. She moved toward it slowly, her stomach twisting into knots. When she picked it up, her entire body went cold. It was Daniel, standing in front of this very house. But he wasn't alone. Michael was beside him, alive. Emily's vision blurred. Her fingers tightened around the frame as a sharp wave of disbelief crashed over her. This wasn't possible. Michael had been dead for 15 years. She had just seen his grave. She had just stood over it, her hands in the dirt, tracing the numbers carved into the stone. But here he was, in this photograph, with Daniel, and the picture wasn't old. Emily's knees threatened to give out. She stumbled back, gripping the edge of the fireplace for support. The walls around her seemed to close in, suffocating. Had Daniel lied to her? Had he known his brother was alive? Had Margaret? 1,000 questions flooded her mind, none of them making sense. Then something else caught her eye. The papers on the table. Emily moved toward them, her hands shaking as she picked one up. It was a letter written in Daniel's handwriting. Emily, if you're reading this, then you've made it this far. I don't know how much time I have left, but there are things you need to know. Things I should have told you from the beginning. But I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of what it would do to you. I never wanted you to carry this burden. But now you have no choice. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, her fingers tightening around the letter. You have to find him. Her breath hitched. Find him. Michael. Emily's world tilted. Daniel had been trying to tell her something all along. He had left her these clues not just to uncover a secret, but to find someone. Her hands trembled as she looked back at the photograph. Michael Carter was alive, and she was going to find out why Daniel had kept it a secret. Emily's hands shook as she gripped Daniel's letter, the words blurring as her vision swam with emotions she could barely contain. You have to find him. The weight of that sentence pressed against her chest, threatening to crush her. Michael Carter, the man who had supposedly died 15 years ago, was alive. And Daniel had known. The photograph was still clutched in her other hand, the image burning into her mind. Daniel and Michael stood side by side, in front of this very house, both of them alive, both of them looking directly at the camera. There was something in Daniel's expression, an urgency, as if he knew this moment was important, as if he knew someone would need to see it someday. Emily inhaled sharply, forcing herself to steady her shaking hands. She needed to think, to focus. There was more in this house. More answers, more pieces of whatever puzzle Daniel had left behind for her. She set the letter and the photograph down carefully on the table and scanned the rest of the room. Dust coated every surface, undisturbed except for the faint marks left by her fingertips. The house had been abandoned, untouched for what seemed like years, and yet, something about it felt preserved, as if someone had left it this way intentionally. She stepped away from the table, her eyes tracing the edges of the room. The dim light filtering through the broken blinds cast long shadows across the walls, making the place feel even more frozen in time. She hesitated before stepping further inside, her heartbeat steady but fast, each step cautious, careful. The kitchen was small, with cabinets that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. She hesitated before reaching for one, pulling it open slowly. Empty. Another. Empty. She continued searching, her fingers trailing over the surfaces, feeling for something, anything, that seemed out of place. Then, as she moved toward the far end of the kitchen, her foot hit something solid beneath the floorboards. She froze. The sound was different, hollow. Her pulse quickened as she crouched down, running her hands over the floor, pressing against the wooden planks. It didn't take long to find it. A small, almost imperceptible gap between two boards. A hidden compartment. Her fingers found the edge, prying at the wood, her breath coming in shallow bursts. It resisted at first, but after a few hard pulls, the board lifted slightly, revealing a dark space beneath it. Emily reached inside, her hands brushing against something rough. She pulled it out slowly, her breath hitching as she realized what it was. A journal. It was old, the leather cover cracked with age, the spine worn from use. The initials MC were etched faintly into the corner. Michael Carter. Emily swallowed hard, running her fingers over the leather before carefully opening it. The pages inside were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. She turned to the first page, her heart hammering against her ribs. If anyone ever finds this, then the truth has already started to unravel. My name is Michael Carter, and if you're reading this, you need to know, I didn't die. But I should have. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. She turned the page, scanning the words, each sentence more unnerving than the last. For years, I lived with a secret I couldn't tell anyone. Started as something small, something I thought I could ignore. But the more I tried to forget, the more it consumed me. And then one day I made a choice that changed everything. I walked away. I let the world believe I was gone. But some secrets don't stay buried forever. And now, I fear time is running out. Emily's hands tightened around the journal. Michael had faked his death. But why? What had been so terrible that he had chosen to disappear rather than face it? And why had Daniel kept it from her? She turned another page, her eyes scanning the writing frantically. Daniel knew the truth. He was the only one I could trust. He tried to help me, but in the end, he was caught between two worlds. The life he built and the past he couldn't escape. I warned him not to dig too deep. I told him to let it go, but he never could. And now, I don't know what's coming next. Emily exhaled sharply, her mind spinning. Daniel had known. He had been involved. He had been trying to help Michael. But with what? What had been so dangerous that Daniel had kept it from her? She turned to the final page of the journal, her fingers trembling. If I disappear for good, know this, Daniel was never the enemy. He never wanted to lie, but he was protecting something, or maybe someone. And if you're looking for me, if you're reading this, then you need to go to the place where it all began. Emily's stomach twisted. There was no address, no coordinates, just one word. Holloway. Emily's breath caught. She knew that name. James Holloway, Daniel's old friend. A man she had met only once years ago at their wedding. He had seemed kind enough, polite, charming, even, But Daniel had never talked about him much, and when she had asked, he had always brushed it off. And now, Michael's journal was telling her that Holloway was where it had all begun. Emily clenched her jaw. She had no choice. She needed to find James Holloway, and she needed to find out the truth before it was too late. Emily gripped Michael's journal so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The name Holloway echoed in her mind, reverberating like a ghostly whisper that refused to fade. She had met James Holloway once, briefly, fleetingly, at her own wedding, a moment she had barely thought about in years. And yet, here it was, surfacing from the depths of the past like an omen, demanding her attention. She forced herself to breathe, her fingers trembling as she turned the journal over in her hands. The house around her felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of secrets she wasn't meant to uncover. Dust hung in the air, untouched by time, but now it felt like something more, like a presence, like a whisper of something unfinished. She had spent years grieving Daniel, believing she had lost the man she loved to a cruel, meaningless accident. But what if it wasn't meaningless at all? What if Daniel had been protecting something, someone? And what if, after all this time, she had only just begun to scratch the surface of the truth? Emily exhaled sharply, pushing away the fear that threatened to root her in place. She had come too far to stop now. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly as she typed James Holloway into the search bar. The screen loaded slowly, the weak signal barely holding in this remote location. Finally, a result appeared. James Holloway, a real estate developer, based out of Chicago. Emily's brows furrowed. She hadn't expected that. She had assumed, after all of this secrecy, that James Holloway would have disappeared, faded into obscurity. But here he was, alive and well, still conducting business, still existing in the world as if nothing had ever happened. A wave of frustration bubbled in her chest. If Holloway was so easy to find, then why had Daniel never told her? Why had Michael written his name in a journal hidden beneath the floorboards of an abandoned house? She tapped on the business listing, scanning the address. His office wasn't far, just a few hours away. Emily inhaled sharply. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed Michael's journal, the photograph of Daniel and Michael, and the wooden box that had started it all, shoving them into her bag. Then, without a second thought, she turned on her heel and walked out of the house, leaving behind the dust, the silence, and the past that refused to stay buried. The drive to Chicago was long, the weight of her discovery pressing heavily on her shoulders. The highway stretched endlessly before her, the distant skyline growing larger with each passing mile. Emily's thoughts refused to settle, her mind looping through every possibility, every unanswered question. When she finally arrived at Holloway's office, the sky had darkened into the deep hues of twilight. The building was modern, sleek, a sharp contrast to the old and forgotten places Daniel had led her to. Emily parked across the street, staring at the towering glass windows reflecting the last remnants of daylight. She wasn't sure what she expected. Would Holloway recognize her? Would he lie? Or worse, would he refuse to speak at all? She gritted her teeth. She had come this far. She wasn't turning back now. She stepped out of the car, her bag slung over her shoulder, her heartbeat steady but fast. As she pushed open the glass doors, the air-conditioned lobby greeted her with an unnatural chill. A receptionist glanced up from behind the desk. "Do you have an appointment?" Emily swallowed. "I need to see James Holloway." The receptionist frowned, giving her a quick once-over. "Mr. Holloway is a very busy man. If you'd like to schedule a meeting, it's about Daniel Carter." The words left her lips before she could second-guess them. The receptionist's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something in her eyes. Emily's stomach tightened. "One moment," the woman said, picking up the phone. Emily stood still, her heart hammering as the seconds stretched into eternity. Then, finally, the receptionist hung up and glanced at her again. "Take the elevator to the top floor. Mr. Holloway will see you now." Emily exhaled, steadying herself. She stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb higher and higher, the hum of the machinery filling the silence. When the doors slid open, she was met with a large, sleek office, dimly lit except for the city lights glowing through the massive windows. And there he was. James Holloway stood near his desk, hands in his pockets, his silhouette cast in shadows. Emily took a step forward. "You remember me, don't you?" Holloway turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Emily Carter." His voice was smooth, carefully measured. "It's been a long time." Emily clenched her jaw. "Not long enough." A slow, knowing smile curved on Holloway's lips. "You've been digging, haven't you?" She narrowed her eyes. "You tell me." Holloway let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "I was wondering how long it would take before you found me." Emily's breath hitched. "So you knew I'd come looking." "I had a feeling." Emily took another step forward, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "Then start talking. Tell me what Daniel was hiding. Tell me what you and Michael have to do with any of this." Holloway's expression remained infuriatingly calm. "You already know more than you should, Emily." "That's not an answer." Holloway exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I knew Daniel before you did. Before he met you, before he built the life you shared. And before that, he knew Michael. The three of us. We were involved in something we shouldn't have been." Emily's chest tightened. "What do you mean involved?" Holloway's gaze darkened. "Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered." Emily's stomach twisted. "But Daniel wanted me to find the truth. He left me clues. He left me this." She pulled the photograph from her bag, shoving it toward him. "Explain this." Holloway's jaw tensed as his eyes flicked to the image. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Holloway sighed. "If you really want to know, Emily, I'll tell you." Emily's pulse pounded. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. She had come too far to stop now. Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. The city lights flickered against the glass windows behind James Holloway, casting long shadows across the dimly lit office. He had said it so easily, as if the truth was something he had always been prepared to share, when the time was right. And now, here she was, standing in front of the only man who might be able to answer the questions that had been clawing at her from the moment she saw those coordinates on Daniel's casket. Holloway sighed, his gaze shifting to the photograph in her trembling hands. Daniel and Michael, together, in front of the house she had found in the woods. The house that shouldn't have existed. The house where she had uncovered a journal that shattered everything she thought she knew about her husband. "I don't even know where to start," Holloway muttered, running a hand down his face. Emily's voice was hoarse, raw. "Start with the truth." Holloway lifted his gaze to meet hers. "The truth isn't simple, Emily." Her fingers curled into fists. "Then make it simple." A long silence stretched between them. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on the room like thick fog, suffocating and endless. Finally, Holloway walked toward his desk, pulling open a drawer. He retrieved a thick manila folder and tossed it onto the polished surface in front of her. Emily hesitated before stepping forward. The folder was old, the edges worn, the corners creased. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, flipping it open. What she saw made her stomach lurch. Photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. She picked up the first photograph. It was a surveillance image, grainy but clear enough to recognize the two figures standing in a dimly lit alley. One of them was Daniel, the other Michael. Her breath hitched. The timestamp in the corner made her pulse hammer. It was dated 2 years after Michael had supposedly died. Emily's fingers tightened around the edges of the photograph. "He was alive," she whispered, more to herself than to Holloway. Holloway nodded slowly. "Michael never died. He disappeared. And Daniel helped him do it." Emily's mind reeled. "But why?" Holloway exhaled, flipping through the contents of the folder until he landed on a stack of typed pages. He slid one toward her. Emily's eyes scanned the words, confusion morphing into something far more insidious. A list of names. Dozens of them. Some crossed out. Others circled. She shook her head. What is this? Holloway leaned against his desk, arms crossed. It's a list of people who vanished, just like Michael. Some of them ran. Some of them weren't so lucky. Emily's pulse pounded. And Daniel? What was he doing with this? Holloway hesitated before answering. Trying to protect you. The words struck her like a physical blow. She took a shaky step back. No, she whispered. That's not possible. Daniel told me everything. We didn't have secrets. Holloway's expression softened, but there was a sadness in his eyes that made her stomach twist. Emily, you loved Daniel. That much is obvious. But there were things he couldn't tell you. Things he buried so deep that he thought he could keep you safe by pretending they didn't exist. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. No, that's not. He wouldn't. Holloway leaned forward. Do you know why Michael disappeared? Emily clenched her jaw, refusing to let the tears that burned in her eyes fall. I don't know anything anymore. Holloway sighed. Michael discovered something he was never supposed to know. And when he tried to walk away, people wanted him silenced. Daniel was the only person who could help him disappear. And he did. He faked Michael's death. He covered for him. He made sure no one could ever find him. Emily's throat felt tight. Then why did Daniel keep this from me? Why didn't he tell me? Because he knew that the moment you knew the truth, you'd be in danger too. A thick silence settled over the room. Emily's thoughts spiraled, racing too fast for her to keep up. Daniel had been protecting her, lying to her, keeping secrets that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. And now, after all this time, she was standing here, unearthing ghosts she had never even known existed. Her gaze flicked back to the photograph of Daniel and Michael. He was still alive, she murmured. Michael, that means he's still out there, doesn't it? Holloway's expression darkened. I don't know. Emily's stomach twisted. But you think he is? Holloway didn't answer right away. He walked over to the window, staring out at the city for a long moment. I think Michael knew something that made him a target. And I think Daniel was the only reason he survived as long as he did. But Daniel is gone now. And if Michael is still out there... Emily stepped forward, her pulse hammering. Then he's alone. Holloway turned back to face her. And running out of time. A heavy silence filled the space between them. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. Then I have to find him. Holloway's expression hardened. You don't know what you're getting into. I don't care. You should. Emily's jaw clenched. Daniel wanted me to find the truth. He led me here. And if Michael is still out there, I'm not stopping until I find him. Holloway studied her for a long moment before sighing. Then there's something else you need to see. Emily's heart pounded as he reached into the drawer of his desk again, this time pulling out something much smaller. A single key. He held it out to her. This belonged to Daniel. Emily hesitated before taking it. It was cold, unfamiliar. A simple silver key with no markings. What does it open? She asked. Holloway met her gaze. A storage unit. Emily's breath hitched. Holloway continued, his voice low. Daniel left something behind. Something I think he knew you'd need one day. Emily's fingers tightened around the key. Another secret. Another step toward the truth. She exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Whatever Daniel had hidden away, she was going to find it. And this time, nothing would stop her. Emily's fingers tightened around the key, her pulse drumming in her ears. A storage unit. Another secret. Another layer of truth that Daniel had hidden away, waiting for her to uncover. The weight of it pressed against her chest, suffocating and relentless. She had come so far, piecing together fragments of a life she had never truly known, unraveling secrets that had been buried so deep they were never meant to see the light of day. And yet, Daniel had left her a path, intentionally, deliberately, because he knew she would follow it. Holloway watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. This key, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Where is the storage unit? Holloway exhaled, walking back to his desk and pulling open another drawer. He retrieved a folded piece of paper, placing it on the surface in front of her. "It's here," he said. "Outside the city. A private facility." Emily reached for the paper, unfolding it slowly. An address was scribbled in Holloway's handwriting, the name of the storage facility barely recognizable to her. She swallowed hard. "How long have you known about this?" Holloway hesitated. "Since the day Daniel died." Emily's breath caught. "And you didn't tell me?" "I didn't know if you'd ever come looking." His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something heavier than guilt. Emily clenched her jaw. "Daniel left me this key for a reason." "I know. Then why didn't you tell me sooner?" Holloway sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because I wasn't sure if you were ready." A cold anger surged through Emily's veins. "You don't get to decide that." "I wasn't trying to," Holloway said quietly. "But once you open that storage unit, there's no turning back." Emily's stomach twisted, but she refused to let fear take hold. "I never planned to turn back." Holloway studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then you should go." Emily inhaled sharply, pocketing the key. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her heartbeat pounding with every step. She had no idea what she would find, but she knew one thing: Daniel had left her something for a reason, and she was going to find out what it was. The drive to the storage facility felt endless. The city lights faded behind her, replaced by long stretches of empty highway and the occasional flickering street lamp. The further she drove, the more isolated she felt. The address Holloway had given her led to the outskirts of a small, almost forgotten industrial town. The roads were cracked, the air thick with the scent of rain, the atmosphere eerily quiet. Emily followed the GPS until she spotted a rusted metal gate, a faded sign hanging above it. Blackwood Storage. Her stomach tightened. She pulled up to the entrance, rolling down her window to press the buzzer. A few moments later, a crackling voice came through. "Can I help you?" Emily hesitated. "I have a unit here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Number 317. There was a pause. Then the gate buzzed open. Emily pulled through, navigating the rows of identical metal doors, each one marked with a number. The place was nearly deserted, the only sound the distant hum of a flickering security light. She parked in front of 317, gripping the key so tightly it dug into her palm. For a long moment, she sat in silence, staring at the door. What had Daniel hidden here? She forced herself to move. Stepping out of the car, she approached the unit, her fingers trembling as she slid the key into the lock. It clicked open easily, as if it had been waiting for her all this time. Emily took a deep breath and pulled the door up. The metal screeched against the track, revealing the darkened interior. Dust hung in the air, the scent of aged paper and metal filling her lungs. She reached for the flashlight on her phone, illuminating the space. At first, she didn't know what she was looking at. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, stacks of folders, old files. The air was thick with the weight of years, of things deliberately stored away. Emily stepped inside cautiously, running her fingers over the dust-covered surfaces. Her eyes landed on a large, locked metal box sitting on the center table. It was newer than the rest, its edges clean, untouched by dust. She reached for it, her breath shallow. There was no keyhole, just a combination lock. Her heart pounded. Daniel wouldn't have made this impossible to open. He had left her everything else. He had to have left her the combination, too. Emily closed her eyes, thinking. Numbers, dates, coordinates. Everything he had left behind had a pattern. Then it hit her. The coordinates on his casket. She exhaled slowly, her fingers moving on instinct as she turned the dials. The numbers clicked into place. The lock released. Emily's chest tightened as she lifted the lid. Inside, neatly organized, were more files. More documents. More pieces of whatever puzzle Daniel had been trying to protect. And then, at the very bottom, something that made Emily's entire body go cold. A letter addressed to her. Her breath hitched as she picked it up, the paper feeling heavier than it should. Daniel's handwriting was unmistakable. With trembling hands, she unfolded it. "Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. And I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to carry this burden. I never wanted you to find out this way. But if you've made it here, it means you didn't give up. It means you were brave enough to look for the truth, even when I wasn't strong enough to tell you." Tears burned in her eyes. "There are things I couldn't say while I was alive. Things I thought I could bury forever. But the past doesn't stay buried. You know that now. And you need to know the truth before it's too late." Emily's vision blurred as she scanned the words, her heart twisting with every sentence. "Michael isn't dead. He never was. But I had to make the world believe he was. I had to make you believe it. Because the truth, the real truth, was too dangerous." Emily's breath came in shallow bursts, her fingers trembling against the paper. "I lied to you, Emily, but I did it to protect you." A sob built in her throat. "But now I need you to do something for me. You need to find Michael." Emily's hands shook violently. "He's the only one who can tell you what really happened. And he's the only one who can finish what I started." The words on the page swam before her eyes, her mind reeling. Michael was alive, and Daniel had spent his last days making sure she would find him. Emily sucked in a sharp breath, her resolve hardening. She was going to find Michael, and she was going to find out what Daniel had died protecting. Emily's fingers clenched around the letter, Daniel's words burning into her mind like a brand. Every sentence, every revelation, unraveled the version of her life she had clung to for so long. Michael wasn't dead. Daniel had lied to her, not to betray her, but to protect her from a truth that had been too dangerous to face. Her heartbeat pounded as she stared at the stacks of files in the metal box. Daniel had hidden all of this away, buried it deep, hoping she would never have to find it. But now there was no stopping. There was no pretending that everything had been as it seemed. She had to find Michael. She had to know why Daniel had spent his last days leading her here. Taking a deep breath, she wiped at the tears clinging to her lashes and forced herself to focus. The answer was here, somewhere in the storage unit. She had to piece it together the same way Daniel had left it for her. She reached for the top folder, her hands still shaking slightly. The first thing she saw was a photograph, grainy, but clear enough to make her stomach drop. It was Michael. Not the Michael from old pictures. Not the young man she had seen in Daniel's photo. This was recent. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his face lined with time. But it was him. He was alive. Emily's breath hitched. If Daniel had this photo, if he had known where Michael was, why hadn't he told her? She flipped through the folder, skimming documents filled with names, dates, places, pieces of a life she didn't recognize. Then, tucked near the back, she found something else. A handwritten note, this one not from Daniel, but from Michael himself. She read the words, her stomach twisting. "Daniel, if something happens, don't come looking for me. You know why? We can't change what we did. We can't fix it. But you have something to lose. You have her. And you need to let this go. I mean it." Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the paper. Michael hadn't wanted to be found, but Daniel had never let it go. And now, here she was, standing in the middle of a storage unit filled with secrets, knowing she had to do the very thing Michael had begged Daniel not to. Find him. Emily took a shaky breath and turned back to the files. There had to be something, some clue Daniel had left behind. Then she saw it. A single envelope, marked with nothing but the word final. Her heart pounded as she reached for it. The paper felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the kind of truth that couldn't be undone. She slid her finger beneath the flap and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her breath caught as she saw what was written inside. Coordinates, another set of numbers, and below them, in Daniel's familiar scrawl, "This is the last place. If you find him, tell him I was sorry." Emily's knees nearly buckled. She grabbed her phone, her fingers moving frantically as she entered the coordinates into the map. The location popped up instantly. A town, a place she had never been, a place far from where Daniel had died. She exhaled sharply, her mind reeling. Daniel had led her here for a reason. And now he was leading her to Michael. There was no turning back. The road stretched endlessly before her, winding through miles of empty land. The coordinates had led her to a small, nearly forgotten town, tucked away from everything familiar. The closer she got, the heavier the weight in her chest became. Daniel had left her this final clue. This was where it ended. Emily gripped the steering wheel tighter, her thoughts a storm of emotions she couldn't contain. What was she about to find? Would Michael even be there? And if he was, would he tell her the truth? She followed the GPS, her breath hitching as she turned onto a narrow road that led to a small house on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, isolated, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to shield it from the world. Emily pulled the car to a stop, staring at the house. It was nothing special, modest, weathered with time, a place that seemed untouched by the chaos of the world. But as she sat there, gripping the letter in her lap, she felt it. This is it. Her stomach twisted as she stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she approached the house, her pulse pounding in her ears. She hesitated for a moment before raising her hand and knocking on the door. Silence. She knocked again, harder this time. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then footsteps. The door creaked open, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She knew him instantly. Michael Carter. He looked older than she had expected, his features lined with age, his eyes tired in a way that spoke of a life spent running. But it was him. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Michael stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally he spoke. "I told him not to send you." Emily's chest tightened. "Daniel didn't send me." Her voice was hoarse. "He's gone." Michael's face barely changed, but something flickered in his eyes. "I know." A lump formed in Emily's throat. "Then why are you still hiding?" Michael exhaled slowly, glancing past her as if checking for something or someone. Then he stepped aside, nodding toward the open door. "Come inside," he said. "You deserve to know the truth." Emily's heart pounded. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The truth was finally within reach, and she wasn't leaving without it. Emily stepped inside the house, her heart pounding so violently she thought Michael might hear it. The air smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of scent that clung to places untouched for too long. The dim lighting cast long shadows against the worn furniture, and despite the stillness, there was a heaviness to the space, as if it held years of secrets waiting to be spoken. Michael closed the door behind her, locking it with an almost instinctive movement. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't look surprised to see her. It was as if he had been expecting this moment, as if he had always known that one day she would come looking for him. Emily clutched Daniel's letter in her hand, her pulse erratic. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face before walking to a small wooden table in the center of the room. He gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "I need to know the truth," she pressed, her fingers tightening around the worn paper in her grasp. "No more half answers. No more lies." Michael studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," he murmured. "You deserve that much." He sat down, his movements careful, calculated. Emily remained standing, her body tense, every nerve on edge. "When did Daniel tell you?" Michael asked finally. Emily's throat tightened. "He didn't." Michael's expression flickered with something she couldn't place. Regret, maybe. Sadness. "He left clues," she continued. "He wanted me to find you." Michael sighed. "Of course he did." Emily's chest ached. "Why?" Michael hesitated. "Because he never let go." Emily clenched her jaw. "Let go of what?" Michael leaned forward, his fingers lacing together as he rested his elbows on the table. "You think you know Daniel, don't you?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "You think he was just your husband, a man who loved you, who built a life with you. But there was another side of him, a side he never wanted you to see." Emily's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" Michael inhaled deeply, as if steadying himself. "Daniel and I, We were involved in something bigger than us, something we tried to walk away from, but the past doesn't let go so easily. Emily felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What was it? Michael shook his head. It doesn't matter anymore. Emily slammed the letter onto the table. It matters to me. Her voice cracked with emotion. Daniel spent his last days leading me here. He wanted me to find you. He wanted me to know. Michael's jaw tightened. For the first time, she saw something break in his expression. Then, finally, he spoke. Daniel helped me disappear. Emily's breath hitched. He saved my life, Michael continued. But it cost him everything. Emily's fingers dug into the edge of the table. What do you mean? Michael hesitated, then stood abruptly. He walked to the corner of the room, where an old metal box sat on the floor. He knelt beside it, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. Emily watched in tense silence as he pulled out a stack of papers, yellowed, brittle with age. He handed them to her. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through them. Documents, legal forms, news clippings, and then her breath caught. A death certificate. Michael Carter. Emily's knees nearly buckled. You faked your death, she whispered, her voice shaking. Michael's gaze didn't waver. I had to. Emily swallowed hard. Why? Michael exhaled. Because if I didn't, someone else would have done it for me. The room spun. The walls felt like they were closing in. Daniel had helped Michael fake his death. He had kept this secret for years, carried the weight of it alone. And she, his wife, had never known. Emily's voice was hoarse. And Daniel? What did it cost him? Michael's expression darkened. Everything. Emily felt a tear slip down her cheek. Michael lowered his gaze. He tried to walk away, Emily, just like I did. But some people don't forget. And they don't forgive. Emily's breath shuddered. Are you saying? Her voice broke. Are you saying Daniel's death wasn't an accident? Michael didn't answer. But he didn't have to. Emily staggered back, her vision blurring. The world tilted. Her husband, the man she had loved, mourned, buried, hadn't just died. He had been taken from her. A sob wrenched from her throat. No. Michael looked at her, his expression hollow. I'm sorry. Emily shook her head violently. No, that's not. She gasped for air, her chest tightening. The realization hitting her like a tidal wave. Daniel had known. He had known he was running out of time. That was why he had left her the clues, the coordinates, the letters. He had been trying to protect her. And now, standing in front of Michael, she realized the truth. Daniel hadn't just been hiding secrets. He had been saying goodbye. Tears blurred her vision as she turned away, gripping the edge of the chair to keep herself from collapsing. The pain was unbearable, suffocating. Michael's voice was soft. He loved you, Emily. Emily let out a choked sob. Then why didn't he tell me? Michael sighed. His eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. Because he knew you wouldn't stop. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. He was right. She had followed every clue, every breadcrumb, and now she knew the truth. But it wasn't the ending she had expected. It was worse. The room fell into silence, the weight of everything pressing down on her. And then a sound, a small voice. Mommy! Emily's breath hitched. She turned slowly, her heart stopping in her chest. Lily stood at the doorway, her tiny fingers gripping the edge of her dress. Her wide eyes locked on something behind Emily. Michael froze. Emily turned. And then her world shattered. There, standing in the dim light, was Daniel. Alive. Emily's knees buckled. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. No, she whispered, barely able to form the word. Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with something she couldn't name. Something that shattered every truth she had believed. Then softly, hoarsely, his voice. I told you not to look for me. Emily's vision blurred. The room spun. Everything she had thought was real. Everything she had believed had been a lie. And now, face to face with the man she had buried, she realized one thing. She hadn't found the truth. She had only just begun.